I never imagined that my proudest day would become my most humiliating one. After 27 years of watching Dylan grow, struggle, and finally succeed, I thought his medical school graduation would be our moment of triumph together. Instead, it became the day my own son publicly erased me from his story. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The reception hall was magnificent, filled with 180 proud families celebrating their new doctors. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over elegant round tables covered in white linens. I had saved for months to buy my best suit for this occasion, pressing it carefully the night before. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my tie in the hotel mirror that morning, not from nervousness about the crowd, but from pure pride. My son, Dylan Rodriguez, was about to become Dr. Rodriguez. When Dylan spotted me near the entrance, something flickered across his face that I couldn't quite identify at the time. Now I realize it was embarrassment. He approached with his wife, Sarah, clinging to his arm, her designer dress probably costing more than I made in 2 months driving for the taxi company. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet someone," Dylan announced to his group of colleagues and their families. The words that followed felt like a physical blow to my chest. "This is the driver who brought me here today." The laughter that erupted from the group was polite but pointed. I felt my face burn with humiliation as I realized he wasn't joking or being modest. He was literally introducing me as hired transportation. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, smiled that perfectly practiced smile she had mastered over the years. "Poor thing, he didn't even go to college," she added, her voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "But he's very reliable for getting Dylan to important events." More laughter. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the polished marble floor and escape this nightmare. But what hurt most wasn't the humiliation from strangers. It was watching my son nod along, avoiding my eyes as if I were truly just the hired help. This was the same boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was 5, the same young man whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose homework I had helped with late into countless nights after my shifts ended. I stood there in my pressed suit, surrounded by people celebrating their children's achievements, feeling more invisible than I had ever felt in my 61 years. The conversations continued around me, as if I had already vanished. Dylan's colleagues talked about their plans for residency. Their families discussed vacation homes and investment portfolios, while I remained frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. "Dad, maybe you should head home now," Dylan said quietly when the group's attention shifted elsewhere. "Sarah and I have several receptions to attend, and they're going quite late." He pressed a $20 bill into my hand like I was actually his driver. "For the gas," he whispered, still not meeting my eyes. But I didn't leave. Instead, I excused myself and walked to my car, retrieving the small flash drive that had been sitting in my glove compartment for 3 years. My wife Margaret had given it to me just weeks before she passed away, making me promise to save it for Dylan's graduation day. "When the time is right, Stephen, show him this. He needs to understand the whole story," she had whispered from her hospital bed. I had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of grief and Dylan's increasing distance from me after his mother's death. But standing there, being treated like hired help by my own son, I remembered Margaret's words. Maybe this was exactly the right time she had been talking about. Walking back into the reception hall, I approached the AV station where a young technician was managing the slideshow of graduation photos. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have something I'd like to share with everyone. It's about one of your graduates." The technician, probably sensing the gravity in my tone, nodded and accepted the flash drive. As the current slideshow faded and the room's attention turned toward the large screen, I felt every eye in the room focus on me. Dylan looked confused and slightly annoyed, probably assuming I was about to embarrass him further. Sarah whispered something in his ear that made his jaw clench. The screen flickered to life, and my wife's face appeared, sitting in our small kitchen with papers spread across the table. She looked directly into the camera with that gentle smile that had gotten me through 35 years of marriage. "If you're watching this, it means Dylan has graduated from medical school, and Stephen has finally decided to share our secret." The room fell completely silent. Dylan's face went white as he recognized his mother's voice. His mother, who had been gone for 3 years, but was somehow speaking directly to him on the most important day of his career. "My dear Dylan," my wife's recorded voice continued from the screen, What you're about to learn will change everything you think you know about your father and your education. Stephen, my love, I hope you're finally ready to tell him the truth." The camera panned to show documents spread across our kitchen table, payroll stubs, university employment records, and photographs that Dylan had never seen. Margaret's voice narrated over each image with the methodical precision of someone who had planned this revelation carefully. "Your father has been working at Riverside Medical University for the past 8 years, Dylan. Not as a driver, not as a janitor, but as the head groundskeeper of the entire campus. Every day while you attended classes, your father was there, maintaining the gardens you walked through, caring for the courtyards where you studied." I watched Dylan's face transform from confusion to shock as photos appeared on screen. Images of me in my work uniform, pruning the rose bushes outside the library where he spent countless hours, maintaining the memorial garden where he often sat between classes, working on the landscape around the very building where he had just graduated. Margaret had been documenting my work for years without my knowledge, taking photos during her visits to campus. She had captured me trimming hedges outside the dormitory where Dylan lived his first year, planting seasonal flowers around the student center where he ate lunch, even installing new benches in the quiet corner of campus where he liked to study for exams. But Stephen wasn't just maintaining the grounds, Dylan. He was watching over you. The screen showed a photo of me talking with Dr. Patricia Mendez, Dylan's favorite anatomy professor. What you didn't know is that your father developed relationships with several of your professors, not by revealing who he was, but simply through the respect he earned as someone who cared deeply about the university. My throat tightened as I remembered those conversations with Dr. Mendez. She would often stop to chat while I worked on the flower beds outside her office windows. She had mentioned struggling to help a brilliant student who was working too hard and burning out during his second year. Without ever saying Dylan was my son, I had asked careful questions, offering insights about young people pushing themselves too hard, sharing stories about resilience that I hoped she might pass along. "Dr. Mendez never knew that Stephen was your father," Margaret's voice explained, but she often told him about a remarkable student named Dylan Rodriguez, who reminded her of the groundskeeper, hard-working, determined, never complaining, even when things got difficult. The video showed more photos, me repairing the study area lighting after Dylan mentioned in a phone call that it was too dim for reading, me ensuring the heating was working properly in the library during Dylan's final exam period, me even coordinating with campus security to make sure the paths Dylan walked late at night were well lit and safe. For 8 years, Stephen has been your invisible guardian angel on that campus. He took the groundskeeper job specifically to be near you, without interfering with your independence. He wanted to support your dreams while respecting your need to succeed on your own merit. I remembered the day I had applied for that position. Dylan was struggling through his first semester, calling home in tears about the workload, the competition, the fear that he wasn't smart enough. I couldn't bear the thought of him suffering alone in that environment, but I also knew he would be mortified if I tried to hover or interfere directly. The groundskeeper position had seemed perfect, a way to be nearby without compromising his autonomy. "But there's more, Dylan," Margaret continued. The screen now showed financial documents that made my chest tight with emotion. "Every year, your father has donated his vacation time and overtime pay to the university's Student Emergency Fund. This scholarship money that helped you when you couldn't afford textbooks your third year. The emergency housing assistance when your roommate moved out unexpectedly. The meal plan extension when you were too proud to ask us for help. All of it came from your father's contributions to that fund." Dylan's hands were shaking now as he stared at the screen. Several of his colleagues had moved closer, drawn in by this unexpected story unfolding at their celebration. I could see Dr. Patricia Mendez in the crowd, her eyes wide with recognition as she began to understand the connections she had never made. "Stephen never told you because he wanted you to believe in your own capabilities." Margaret's voice grew softer, more tender. "He wanted you to graduate knowing that your success came from your intelligence, your hard work, your dedication. But he also made sure that when you stumbled, there was always a safety net, one that looked like institutional support rather than parental rescue." The final photo showed me sitting on a campus bench during my lunch break, watching from a distance as Dylan celebrated passing his medical boards with his study group. My face in that photo showed everything. The pride, the love, the quiet satisfaction of watching my son achieve his dreams while believing he had done it entirely on his own. This is who your father really is, Dylan. Not the uneducated driver you introduced tonight, but the man who spent 8 years being your silent guardian, your invisible supporter, your secret champion. As Margaret's image faded from the screen, the entire reception hall sat in stunned silence. 180 people had just witnessed the most profound love story they had ever seen. Not a romance, but the story of a father's devotion so pure that he had hidden his own contributions to ensure his son's confidence remained intact. Dylan was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he finally understood the magnitude of what his father had done and what he had just thrown away with his thoughtless introduction. The silence in the reception hall stretched for what felt like eternity after Margaret's video ended. I watched Dylan's face cycle through emotions: shock, recognition, shame, and something that looked like devastation. But before anyone could speak, Dr. Patricia Mendez stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale with realization. "Stephen Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "You're Stephen Rodriguez." It wasn't a question. She walked toward me with purpose, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dylan, do you have any idea who your father is to this university?" Dylan looked between us, confusion replacing some of the shock on his face. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, had gone completely quiet for the first time since I'd known her, sensing that the social dynamics had shifted in ways she couldn't control or manipulate. "Dr. Mendez," I said quietly, "please, you don't need to." "No, Stephen. After what I just witnessed, I absolutely need to." She turned to address the entire room, her voice growing stronger. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just learned about a father's secret devotion, but you haven't heard about the respect this man has earned from our faculty." She gestured for me to join her at the front of the room. I hesitated, still feeling the sting of Dylan's earlier rejection, but something in her expression told me this was important. As I walked forward, I noticed other faculty members in the crowd beginning to recognize me, whispers spreading as they connected the groundskeeper they knew with the father they had just learned about. "Stephen Rodriguez has worked on our campus for 8 years, Dr. Mendez announced. In that time, he has become one of the most respected employees at Riverside Medical University, not just because he maintains the most beautiful grounds we've ever had, but because of who he is as a person." She turned to look directly at Dylan. "Your father has never, not once in 8 years, mentioned that his son was a student here. But I can tell you about the countless times he's gone above and beyond his duties. The night before your anatomy final in second year, Dylan, when the study rooms were freezing because of a heating malfunction, your father came in on his day off at midnight to fix the system so you and your classmates could study in comfort." My face flushed as Dr. Mendez continued. "I had hoped these stories would remain private, just part of doing my job well, but she wasn't finished. When Hurricane Maria hit 2 years ago and damaged the library skylights, Stephen worked for 72 hours straight to prevent water damage to the books and computers. He slept in his truck in the parking lot to make sure he could respond immediately to any new problems. The university wanted to hire an emergency contractor, but Stephen insisted he could handle it himself because he knew exactly what needed to be done." Dr. James Morrison, the Dean of Students, stepped forward from the crowd. "Stephen, I didn't realize you were Dylan's father either, but I can add to Patricia's testimony. You've been nominated for the university's Employee Excellence Award 3 years running. The selection committee always struggles with your application because your impact goes so far beyond your job description." He addressed Dylan directly. "Your father has personally mentored 6 different students who were struggling academically or emotionally. He never overstepped boundaries or interfered with faculty responsibilities, but when students were sitting alone outside, looking overwhelmed, Stephen would somehow end up working nearby, available for conversation if they needed it." My chest tightened as I remembered those conversations. There was Maria Santos, who had been ready to quit medical school after failing her first exam. I had found her crying on a bench near the memorial garden, and we had talked about resilience, about how failure was just information, not a verdict. She had graduated summa cum laude last year and was now doing her residency in pediatric surgery. There was James Chen, whose father had died suddenly during his 3rd year. He had been sitting in the rose garden every day for weeks, missing classes, barely eating. I had shared stories about losing my own father young, about how grief could feel overwhelming, but that it didn't have to derail dreams. He was in tonight's graduating class, planning to specialize in family medicine. But here's what makes Stephen truly exceptional, Dr. Morrison continued. He has never once asked for recognition, never requested favors, never tried to leverage his connection to students or faculty for personal gain. He simply does good work and cares about people, expecting nothing in return. Dr. Sarah Williams, the department head of psychiatry, joined the impromptu testimonial. Stephen, you probably don't know this, but several faculty members have discussed creating a position specifically for you, something like campus life coordinator, because we recognize that what you do goes far beyond groundskeeping. You're a counselor, a mentor, a problem solver, and a guardian angel all rolled into one. I looked at Dylan, whose face had gone through another transformation. The shame was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, a dawning awareness of how completely he had misunderstood his father's place in the world he inhabited every day. Dylan, Dr. Mendez said gently, your father never told us you were his son, but he talked about you constantly, never by name, just as my boy or my son. He would ask careful questions about student life, about the challenges young doctors face, about how to support someone pursuing medicine without interfering. Every conversation we had about the pressures of medical school was really him trying to understand what you were going through so he could help without overstepping. She paused, her voice growing emotional. The morning after you passed your boards, Stephen came to work with flowers, not for the grounds, but for the staff break room. He said it was a celebration day but wouldn't explain why. Now I understand. He was celebrating your success with the only family he had on campus, us. The crowd had grown completely silent again, but this time it wasn't shock, it was respect. These people were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the revelation of a father's love, but the uncovering of a genuinely remarkable person who had been hiding in plain sight. Dr. Mendez looked directly at Sarah, my daughter-in-law, whose earlier smugness had evaporated entirely. Mrs. Rodriguez, you said Stephen didn't go to college. That's technically true, but he has educated himself through 8 years of conversations with some of the finest medical minds in the country. He understands anatomy because he's discussed it with anatomy professors. He knows pharmacology because he's listened to pharmacology lectures during his lunch breaks. He could probably pass several of our basic medical exams better than some first-year students. I felt my eyes burning with tears I was trying to hold back. These people, these brilliant doctors and professors, were defending me in ways I had never expected or asked for. But what mattered most was watching Dylan's face as he began to truly understand who his father was, not just to him, but to the community where he had spent the most important years of his education. There's something else, Dr. Morrison said, producing a folder from his briefcase. Stephen, we were planning to present this at the end-of-year faculty meeting, but given tonight's circumstances, it seems appropriate to share it now. He opened the folder and pulled out an official-looking document. The University Board of Directors has approved the creation of the Stephen Rodriguez Campus Life Enhancement Fund, funded by donations from faculty and staff who have worked with you over the years. It's designed to provide emergency support for students facing financial or personal crises that might interfere with their education. The room erupted in spontaneous applause. I stood there, overwhelmed, as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. These people weren't just defending me against my son's thoughtless words, they were honoring me in ways I had never imagined possible. But through it all, my eyes kept returning to Dylan, searching his face for some sign of recognition, some acknowledgement of the man I had been all along, hidden behind his assumptions about education and social status. The applause gradually faded, leaving Dylan and me facing each other across a room full of people who now understood our story better than we had understood it ourselves. His face was streaked with tears, his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Sarah stood beside him, her earlier confidence completely shattered, looking like she wanted to disappear. "Dad," Dylan's voice cracked as he spoke. The single word carried the weight of 8 years of misunderstanding, of opportunities lost to really know each other, of assumptions that had built walls between us. "Dad, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but also like a plea. I looked around the room at all these distinguished people, doctors, professors, university administrators, who had just defended me with more passion than my own son had ever shown. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had found more acceptance and recognition among strangers than in my own family. Because, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, your mother and I wanted you to become the man you were meant to be, not the man who felt obligated to be grateful. I took a step closer to him, ignoring the crowd that was hanging on every word. We wanted you to succeed because of your own merit, your own intelligence, your own determination. If you had known I was there, watching, helping, you might have felt like your achievements weren't entirely your own. Dylan's hands were trembling as he wiped his face. But I've treated you like you were. He couldn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. He had treated me like I was beneath him, like my lack of formal education made me less valuable as a person, like I was uneducated, I finished for him, like I was simple, like I was just the hired help. The words stung to say, but they needed to be said. Dylan, you've become so concerned with status, with appearances, with what other people think, that you forgot to see who people really are. Sarah finally found her voice, but it came out defensive and sharp. Stephen, you have to understand Dylan's position. In medical circles, image matters. Professional associations matter. Dylan has worked incredibly hard to build his reputation. Sarah. Dylan's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. Stop talking. The command was quiet but absolute, and for the first time since I had known her, Sarah actually obeyed him. Dylan kept his eyes on me as he continued. Dad, what Sarah thinks doesn't matter right now. What I think of my reputation doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I just publicly humiliated the most important person in my life because I was embarrassed by what other people might think. He turned to address the room, his voice growing stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an apology for what you witnessed earlier. I introduced my father as the driver who brought me because I was ashamed. Not ashamed of him, but ashamed of what I thought his job said about our family's social status. The admission seemed to physically pain him, but he continued. I have spent years distancing myself from my father because I thought his blue-collar background would somehow diminish my professional standing. I have been so focused on becoming someone important that I forgot to notice I was already the son of someone extraordinary. Dr. Mendez stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Dylan, if I may, I think there's something else you need to understand. Your father's work ethic, his integrity, his genuine care for others, these aren't qualities that come from education or social status. These are character traits that can't be taught in any classroom. In many ways, you are who you are as a doctor because of who he is as a man. She gestured toward me with obvious respect. Every time you show patience with a difficult patient, every time you go the extra mile to help someone who can't pay their bills, every time you treat people with dignity regardless of their background, that's your father's influence, not your medical training. Dylan looked at me with fresh eyes as if seeing me for the first time. All those conversations we had about treating people fairly, about doing right by others even when no one was watching, about finding satisfaction in honest work. You weren't just giving me advice. You were showing me how you lived every day. I nodded, feeling some of the tension in my chest begin to ease. Your mother and I, we never wanted you to feel like you had to choose between success and values. We wanted you to understand that real success isn't about impressing other people. It's about being someone you can respect when you look in the mirror. The crowd was completely silent now, witnessing what felt like a private conversation between father and son, but understanding that this moment was bigger than just our family drama. This was about fundamental questions of worth, respect, and what really matters in life. But Dad, Dylan said, his voice breaking again, I've wasted so much time. All these years when I could have been learning from you, getting to know you as more than just my father, understanding the incredible person you are, I threw it all away because I was worried about what people would think. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up again. Dylan, you're being too hard on yourself. You had goals, aspirations. It's natural to want to associate with people who can help your career. Sarah, I said, stop talking. This time Dylan's voice carried an edge that surprised everyone, including me. He turned to face her fully, and I could see something changing in his expression, a hardness that hadn't been there before. Actually, you know what? I think it's time you said a lot more. I think it's time you explained to everyone here exactly what role you've played in turning me into someone who would be ashamed of my own father. The shift in the room's energy was palpable. Sarah's face went pale as she realized that Dylan was no longer the malleable husband she thought she could control. The revelation about my true character had apparently triggered something in Dylan that went beyond just his relationship with me. I think, Dylan continued, his voice growing colder. "It's time we all heard about the conversations you've had with me about my embarrassing family background, about your suggestions that I minimize contact with my father, about your concerns that his simple lifestyle might reflect poorly on us." Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly unprepared for this public confrontation. The crowd watched with fascination as the evening's revelations took yet another unexpected turn. The night that had begun with my humiliation was turning into something entirely different, a reckoning that went far beyond the relationship between father and son. Sarah looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The same crowd that had been politely laughing at her condescending comments about me earlier was now staring at her with obvious disapproval. The social dynamics had shifted completely, and she was no longer the sophisticated doctor's wife holding court. She was the villain in a story that everyone else had come to understand. "Dylan, this isn't the place for this conversation," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We should discuss this privately at home, when emotions aren't running so high." "No, Sarah, we're discussing it right here, right now, in front of all these people who just learned what kind of man my father really is." Dylan's voice carried an authority I had never heard from him before, because I think they deserve to understand how I became someone who could treat him the way I did tonight. Dr. Mendez and several other faculty members exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something significant beyond just family drama. This was about the formation of character, about the influences that shape how we treat others, about the difference between genuine class and artificial status. "Tell them about the conversation we had last month," Dylan continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "When I mentioned that Dad was proud of my residency placement. Tell them what you said about managing expectations with my family." Sarah's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger and embarrassment creeping up her neck. "Dylan, you're twisting things. I never said anything against your father specifically. I simply suggested that as you advance in your career, it's important to be strategic about professional relationships and social connections." "Strategic." I repeated the word quietly, but in the silent room, everyone heard it. "Is that what family relationships are to you, Sarah? Strategic considerations?" She turned to me with a flash of her old arrogance, apparently deciding that offense was her best defense. "Stephen, with all due respect, you don't understand the pressures Dylan faces in his field. Medicine is competitive. Doctors are judged not just on their skills, but on their social connections, their family backgrounds, their ability to fit into certain circles." "So you advised your husband to be ashamed of his father," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "You counseled him to hide his family background because it might interfere with his professional advancement." Sarah's composure cracked further. "I advised him to be practical. Dylan has opportunities to join prestigious practices, to build relationships with influential physicians, to create a life of real success. That requires a certain presentation." "And what presentation is that exactly?" Dr. Williams asked, her psychiatrist's training evident in how she was dissecting Sarah's responses. "What kind of presentation requires a man to deny his own father?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Sarah looked around the room, realizing that she had lost whatever sympathy or understanding she might have had from this crowd. These were educated, successful people who had just witnessed genuine character and were finding her values wanting. "I think," Dylan said slowly, "what Sarah is trying to say is that she believes worth is determined by education credentials, income levels, and social status. She's been very clear about this in our private conversations." He turned to address the room, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "For the past 3 years, since we got married, Sarah has been systematically discouraging my relationship with my father. Not through direct confrontation, but through subtle suggestions, casual comments, strategic concerns about appearances." Sarah's face had gone from flushed to pale, but Dylan continued his public examination of their relationship. "She suggested that family gatherings at my father's house were depressing because of the neighborhood. She recommended that we host holidays at restaurants instead of Dad's dining room because it would be more comfortable for everyone. She even suggested that when I established my own practice, it might be better to limit references to my family background in promotional materials." The crowd's murmur of disapproval was audible now. These were people who understood family loyalty, who had built their own success without forgetting where they came from. Sarah's calculated approach to relationships was clearly striking them as deeply wrong. "But here's what I'm just now realizing," Dylan said, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Sarah didn't just want me to distance myself from Dad because of his job or education level. She wanted me to distance myself from his values. Because Dad's approach to life, caring about people regardless of their status, finding satisfaction in honest work, treating everyone with dignity, that approach doesn't align with the kind of social climbing Sarah had planned for our marriage." Sarah finally found her voice, and when she spoke, her mask slipped completely. "Dylan, you're being ridiculous. Your father is a nice man, but he's a groundskeeper. He doesn't understand the world you're entering, the opportunities you're going to have, the kind of life we can build together. I've been trying to help you see the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" Dr. Mendez repeated, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Mrs. Rodriguez, help me understand this bigger picture. Are you saying that Stephen's 8 years of dedicated service to this university, his mentoring of struggling students, his integrity and work ethic are less valuable than the social connections he might provide?" "I'm saying that in the real world, connections matter. Appearances matter. Success requires strategic thinking about relationships and social positioning." Sarah's voice had taken on a lecturing tone, as if she were explaining basic facts to naive children. "Whose success?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Excuse me? Whose success requires this strategic thinking? Dylan's success as a doctor, or your success as a doctor's wife?" The distinction hit its target. Sarah's mouth opened and closed as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely self-serving. Dylan was staring at his wife with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of disgust and revelation, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "Dad, I think I'm finally understanding something. These past 3 years, when I thought I was growing more sophisticated, more professional, more successful, I was actually just becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who could be embarrassed by the most honorable man I know." He turned back to Sarah, and his voice carried a finality that made my chest tighten. "Sarah, I want you to leave." "What?" Her voice cracked with shock. "I want you to leave this reception. I want you to go home, pack your things, and find somewhere else to stay tonight. We'll talk about the future of our marriage later, but right now I can't stand to look at you." The room held its collective breath. Sarah looked around desperately, perhaps hoping someone would intervene on her behalf, but found only faces that ranged from sympathetic to openly hostile. She had lost any allies she might have had with her earlier comments about my education and her recent revelations about her approach to family relationships. "Dylan, you're making a mistake. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. In a few days, when you've calmed down, you'll realize that I was only trying to help you succeed." "Sarah," Dylan said, his voice quiet but absolute, "the only mistake I made was listening to you instead of learning from him." He gestured toward me with a respect that I hadn't heard in years. "Dad has spent 8 years proving his worth to the people in this room without ever asking for recognition or status. You've spent 3 years trying to convince me that worth is something you can buy or marry or social climb your way into." He paused, looking directly at her. "One of those approaches has earned genuine respect. The other has earned exactly what it deserves." Sarah gathered what remained of her dignity, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the exit. But she stopped at the door and turned back, her voice carrying across the silent room with venomous clarity. "You'll regret this, Dylan. When reality sets in and you realize what opportunities you're throwing away for the sake of sentiment, you'll remember that I was the one trying to help you build something bigger than a groundskeeper's son could imagine." The insult to me was clear, but what struck me was how it revealed the depth of her contempt, not just for me but for Dylan himself. In her mind, he would always be a groundskeeper's son, someone whose origins placed limits on what he could achieve or deserve. After she left, the room remained quiet for several long moments. Then Dr. Mendez began to clap, slowly and deliberately. One by one, others joined her until the entire reception was applauding, not for the drama they had witnessed, but for Dylan's decision to choose character over convenience, family over social strategy. Dylan walked over to me, tears streaming down his face openly now. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for tonight. I'm sorry for the past 3 years. I'm sorry for becoming someone who could treat you the way I did." I reached out and pulled my son into a hug that we both needed desperately. As his shoulders shook against mine, I felt like I was finally getting my boy back. Not the status-conscious young doctor he had become, but the thoughtful, caring person his mother and I had raised. "It's okay, son," I whispered. "It's okay. We're going to be okay." 6 months later, I was pruning the roses outside the medical school library when Dylan found me during his lunch break. It had become our weekly tradition, him bringing sandwiches from the cafeteria, me sharing the thermos of coffee I always carried. We would sit on the bench I had installed years earlier, the one positioned perfectly to overlook the memorial garden where he used to study. "The divorce papers are final," he said, settling beside me and unwrapping his sandwich. There was relief in his voice, not sadness. The past 6 months had been difficult but clarifying. Sarah had fought the divorce initially, apparently believing that Dylan would come to his senses and return to her vision of their upwardly mobile future. When she realized he was serious, she had become vindictive, trying to claim half of assets that didn't exist and threatening to ruin his reputation in medical circles. "How do you feel about it?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer from the lightness in his bearing, the way he had started smiling again. "Like I can breathe for the first time in 3 years, he admitted. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending trying to be someone I'm not, trying to live up to expectations that were never mine to begin with. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching students hurry between classes. Several of them waved to me as they passed. I'd become something of a campus fixture over the years, known not just as the groundskeeper, but as someone students could talk to when they needed perspective or encouragement. "Dad, I've been thinking about something," Dylan said, his voice carrying a note of excitement I hadn't heard since he was a child. "I've decided not to take the position at Mercy General." Mercy General was the prestigious hospital that had offered him a residency position, the kind of opportunity that Sarah would have considered essential for building the right kind of career. "Oh, what are you thinking instead?" "I want to work at the community clinic downtown, the one that serves the uninsured population, the immigrants, the people who can't afford regular health care." He turned to look at me directly. "It doesn't pay as much. It doesn't carry the same prestige, but it's where I think I can do the most good." I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with his medical degree and everything to do with the man he was choosing to become. "What made you decide that?" "You did," he said simply. "These past 6 months watching you work, really seeing what you do here, understanding how you've chosen to live your life, it made me realize that satisfaction doesn't come from impressing other people. It comes from being useful, from making a difference in the lives of people who need help." He gestured around the campus, taking in the carefully maintained grounds, the students studying in peaceful garden spaces, the overall sense of beauty and care that I had helped create. "You've spent 8 years making this place better for thousands of students, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of work well done. I want to practice medicine the same way, focused on service, not status. Your mother would be proud," I said, and meant it completely. This was exactly the kind of man Margaret and I had hoped he would become, before life and unfortunate influences had temporarily led him astray. "There's something else," Dylan continued, his voice growing more excited. "Dr. Mendez has been talking to the university administration about expanding your role here. They want to create a position called Campus Life Coordinator, exactly like she mentioned that night. It would involve counseling students, coordinating support services, managing the emergency fund, and yes, still maintaining the grounds, because everyone agrees the campus has never looked better." I was touched, but cautious. "Dylan, I hope this isn't happening because of what occurred at your graduation. I don't want charity or pity positions." "Dad, this has nothing to do with charity. The university has been discussing this for 2 years, apparently. You've basically been doing this job unofficially since you started here. They want to make it official, give you the recognition and compensation you deserve, and expand the program because it's been so successful." He pulled out a folder from his backpack. "Doctor, Morrison asked me to give you these preliminary job descriptions and compensation details. They want to meet with you next week to discuss it formally." I opened the folder with trembling hands. The salary they were proposing was nearly double what I currently made, with benefits that would secure my retirement and health insurance for life. But more than the money, it was the job description that moved me, officially recognizing the mentoring, counseling, and student support work I had been doing informally for years. "There's one more thing," Dylan said, his voice growing soft. "They want to rename the Student Emergency Fund. They're calling it the Margaret Rodriguez Memorial Fund for Student Support in honor of Mum's belief in helping young people achieve their dreams. The tears came without warning. Margaret had died believing that her video message might help Dylan understand his father better, but she never could have imagined it would lead to this. Her memory being honored at the university where her son studied, her values of service and compassion being institutionalized to help future generations of students. She would love that, I managed to say through my tears. I know she would. And Dad, I want you to know, I'm proud to be your son. Not because you're getting official recognition now, but because you've always been the kind of man worth being proud of. I just lost sight of that for a while. We finished our lunch in companionable silence, watching the life of the campus unfold around us. Students laughed and stressed and dreamed and grew, just as Dylan had done years earlier. But now I could see them all clearly. Not as obstacles to my son's success or threats to our family's social standing, but as young people deserving of care and support, regardless of their backgrounds or destinations. You know what I realized, Dylan said as we prepared to return to our respective work. All those years when I thought I was working to become someone important, I already was someone important. I was your son and Mom's son, and that should have been enough. He stood up and dusted off his scrubs. He had started eating lunch in his work clothes instead of changing into expensive casual wear, another small sign of his changing priorities. I'm going to stop by after work tonight, if that's okay. Maybe we could work on the garden together like we used to when I was little. I'd like that very much, I said, meaning it completely. As I watched him walk back toward the medical building, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The humiliation of graduation night had been transformed into something beautiful, not just reconciliation between father and son, but the discovery of who we really were when we stopped worrying about who we thought we should be. The roses I had been pruning earlier were beginning to bloom, their colors vivid in the afternoon sunlight. Like my relationship with Dylan, they had needed careful tending, patient work, and faith that beauty would eventually emerge from the cutting away of what no longer served. Margaret had been right to prepare that video, right to trust that the truth would eventually prevail. She had planted seeds that took years to germinate, but they had finally bloomed into something more beautiful than either of us had dared to hope. I gathered my tools and headed back to the maintenance building, already looking forward to the evening ahead. Dylan would come home, we would work in the garden together, and we would continue the slow, satisfying work of growing something beautiful from the ground up, just like we had always done and just like we always would.